In this video, we'll start to look at how to actually play the game using the maps and pieces we've been talking about. Before we begin, let me point out that these videos are not meant to replace reading the rules. My intent here is to supplement the rules by showing you how to put them into practice. I will show you examples and explain how the rules allow you to simulate the military operations encompassed by the games. In this video, I'm going to show you the basics of how to move pieces around on the map board. The games are played in turns, with each turn representing about 4 days of real time. The sequence of play for each turn, as explained in the rules, involves one side moving and then attacking, and then the other side moving and attacking. This video will cover the rules concerning basic ground movement of units. The pieces or counters that represent specific units are located in specific hexes. They move between hexes by expending available movement points. As you'll recall from the explanation of the information on a counter, the value on the lower right is the number of movement points the unit possesses. The total number of movement points available to a unit for a turn is sometimes referred to as the unit's movement allowance. Each turn, every unit controlled by a side can move up to the limits of its movement allowance. Players will need to keep track of which units have moved. An easy way to do this is to just rotate the counters of units that have moved by 90 degrees. Watch me do this here, for example. Let's say that this unit moves from 1512 to 1313, and then I just turn it on its side to reflect that it's finished moving. So here is a solitary unit, the German 6th Landwehr Brigade. It has a movement allowance of 4 movement points down here on the lower right. It can use these 4 movement points during the German movement phase of a turn to move between hexes. In moving, units move from hex to adjacent hex. The cost of moving between adjacent hexes depends on the terrain and the hex side that the 2 adjacent hexes share. For example, look at where the brigade is located in hex 1512. If this unit were to move from 1512 to 1513, it would be moving across clear terrain. If it were to move from 1512 to 1411, it would be moving through woods. This is the terrain effects chart that's on the back of the rule booklet. This chart shows the effects of different terrain on movement in combat. From this chart, you can see that moving across a clear hex side costs 1 movement point. That's what the 1 MP stands for. You can also see that moving through woods costs 2 movement points, while moving through swamp costs 3. Also note that rivers add 1 to the cost of crossing a hex side, whereas in some cases, rail lines reduce the cost of moving from hex to hex. Now let's move the brigade on the map. It has a movement allowance of 4. It moves from hex 1512 to 1411. You'll have to excuse me, I'm using a graphics program that when I click on the unit, it will just cause those little symbols to come up. In moving from 1512 to 1411, we've crossed woods as the terrain. This will then cost us 2 movement points. It then moves from 1411 to 1311. In doing so, it crosses clear terrain, and this will cost it 1 more movement point. So now it's moved a total of 3 movement points. And it would continue on, if it wanted to hex 1210. using the last of its available movement points. So moving from 1512, 1411 costs 2, and to 1311 costs another 1, total of 3, and then to 1210, total of 4. Now let's look at an example that shows the importance of route selection. Let's say this time that the brigade starts the turn in hex 1410 and wants to move down here to hex 1313. First it looks at the path west of the lake. It is moving from 1410 to 1311, 1312, and then down to 1313. Moving from 1410 to 1311, it will be traveling through broken terrain and also crossing a river. This would cost, moving here, a total of 2 movement points, one for the broken terrain and an additional one for the river. So this would cost 2. Moving south to 1312 through, again, broken terrain would cost another point, bringing its total that it has expended to 3. Continuing on to 1313, though, through woods would cost 2 more movement points, which would bring the total needed to 5. But the unit has only 4 movement points, so it would have to end its movement right here in 1312. If, however, it were to pass east of the lake on its way to 1313, it could probably make it. This is because moving from 1410 to 1411 would cost, again, 2 movement points, one for the broken terrain and another for the river. Then moving from 1411 to 1412 would cost 1 more, 3, and then it could move from 1412 to 1313 through clear terrain, and that would then be 4 movement points. Now let's say the brigade starts the turn in hex 1313 and wanted to move directly to hex 1413. Since Germany and Russia are already at war in the game, the border is no impediment. The terrain between the 2 hexes is swamp. There's also a river, and there's also a single track rail line between the 2 hexes. The combined cost of traveling from 1313 to 1413 is 3 for the swamp terrain, plus 1 for the river, which would be 4 movement points. But at this cost, the single track rail line comes into play and would reduce the cost of moving across this hex side by 1, bringing the cost back down to 3. This benefit is a representation of parts of the unit being able to walk across the river on the rail bridge. Units in combat usually move in a tactical fashion, which means that they take precautions against ambush and similar measures. If a unit does not move next to an enemy unit in the course of a turn, it may increase its movement allowance by not taking these precautions. This is called column movement. Units that use column movement increase their movement allowance by 50%. If, for example, the brigade we see here in hex 1310 were to not move next to an enemy unit, it could increase its movement allowance from its printed 4 to a total of 6 movement points by using column movement. In this example, there's an enemy unit down here in hex 1515. The German brigade could use column movement to move from 1310 to 1410, spending 1 movement point, then on to 1411, expending 2 more, total of 3, then to 1412, a total of 4, then to 1413, for a total of 5. By using column movement, it still has one movement point left, but it could not move to hex 1414 or 1514 because using column movement, it is not allowed to move next to an enemy unit.